Hello folks, I'm Rob and we're here with John and we're going to be talking about tanks.
Hello, welcome to Totally Tanked.
We are totally tanked, and today we're talking about the Type 95 Ha-Go, Japanese tank from built from 1936 onwards.
But first,
But first,
we must talk of recent developments in the world of tanks.
there is
As in the actual world of tanks.
and the actual world and the tank battles that are happening right now as we speak. Armenia and Azerbaijan are having real-life tank battles in how do you pronounce the...
Nagorno-Karabakh.
Yeah, that region.
There's another name that you're meant to use if you're of the Armenian persuasion, but Nagorno-Karabakh is what most people who know of it know it as. So you've got an enclave of Armenians in Azerbaijan. They've been basically independent since a war about 30 years ago. There's been conflict on and off since. The Azeris, with heavy Turkish support, have invaded their own country. It's complicated.
Main thing is the Turkish don't like the Armenians.
Turkish have been trying to murder Armenians at any excuse for a long time, and then they will deny that Armenians ever existed and that they ever murdered them, which is a charming part of Turkish nationalism. But then again, all nationalism can be pretty ugly. Certainly, Australian nationalism is not a pretty beast either. So, lots of tanks, mostly old T-72s. Not with the latest armour or sensors or anything, but...
Or electronics or...
No, but the big issue is what some people are calling suicide drones, which sounds very exciting. I think loitering munitions is a better name for them.
Yeah. Things that you can fire up into the air, they'll hang around up there and say, hang on, what's that moving over there? I can loiter. Oh, there's a target I would like to destroy, and then go down and hit it. So rather than a piece of artillery that'll just go up and then come down again, it'll go up and hang around for a bit.
Yeah, and wait for tasking. And I believe the better ones can be landed and refueled and sent back up as well. There's all sorts of ways you can do it. Some of them can get fired out of MLRS tubes, so, what they're called Stalin's organ. Back in the day, so lots of tubes on the back of a truck that would normally fire missiles, but now they're firing
douches or whatever they
call. So things like that. So firing munitions. The other big advance that's happened is the Azeris have invested very heavily in a lot of Israeli-made stuff. It should be noted, and apparently their use of ground terrain mapping radar is making moving any large vehicle on the battlefield extremely dangerous.
They also have a better recruiting rock music video than the Armenians.
They do have the best rock music videos. Certainly much better than Australia's army music videos, which I've been involved in and are not well thought of. Not that that's the fault of any of the people involved.
But
except maybe the people who paid for the video to be made. I don't know.
The Azeris have got a decent video on the internet, on YouTube. If
Quite
you want
a few.
Yeah,
they've got a whole series of them. They've got a little Azeri military rock band with a...
Not that we're condoning fighting on either side, and
we're not. Well, I'm kind of very sympathetic to the Armenians in most of these things, but the Azeris do kind of have a point that it's meant to be part of their country.
Yeah.
And no one's been willing to support changing the border. The Russians have kind of been hoping this conflict would go away, and it looks like the Turks have stirred it up. Is my read on what's happening? I could be wrong. Anyone who tells you they know exactly what wrong is probably lying to you.
I'm sure Taiwan will hope you take the same attitude in when China comes across.
Yeah. Now, look, the thing for tanks is fundamentally, I think a future tank is going to have some capacity better than the tank commander spraying with a 50 caliber to deal with airborne threats, because
Put
otherwise,
a CIWS on top of it.
Something like that. Maybe I'm thinking maybe something a little smarter and more integrated. But
I'm sure there's some defence industry things out in Fishwick that are shipping them off to Qatar at the moment.
Yeah. Now, fundamentally, I still strongly hold the view that human packages are still going to need to be sent into the battlefield. if only to act as nodes for all the drones, because there just isn't the bandwidth to have thousands and thousands of drones all being controlled from Virginia or wherever. They run out of communications capacity on the battlefield for large groups, and they have problems with that even 15 years ago. Admittedly, communications have gotten better, but the number of drones have been proliferating, so you still need local control of some sort, probably line of sight, otherwise jamming becomes a huge issue. So you still need to put people out into the battlefield. You still need to protect them, which means a certain weight of armour. You still need a meaningful package for them to be sent with, and electronic warfare packages and radars, these things are heavy and need a lot of power. So something like a tank is going to exist in 100 years' time. It might have a very different
role.
set of...
It might be a long way behind what the front line might be, and just have a big electronics package, just like your AWACS aircraft at the moment. It has big electronics packages because they just sit up there and fly around a lot. So
that style of thing, yeah, and they run one engine just to run the electronics. Yeah, it's kind of why the F-18 has two engines. Look, you're still going to have tank-like things, but what they do will probably change. And the idea that a tank is just a lot of armour and a big gun, I don't think that's going to be tenable in the medium to long term. It's not really tenable right now, even on Caucasian battlefields.
They're still very effective driving through a city and wanting to blow up buildings.
It is, but when kids with a hobbyist drone and a homemade shaped charge can land a satchel bomb or basically a shaped charge on your thin tank roof armour, you got to have better ways of keeping those things away. Anywho. So
so there are actual fighting with tanks, between tank-on-tank battles happening in the real world at the moment. So we thought we'd like to point that out to
people.
And
loitering munitions are really destroying a lot of them. Yep. And ground terrain mapping radar is making it very hard to move unprotected large vehicles.
And just the drones' ability to recon areas and loiter in the areas and provide accurate information to the artillery supporting them, and suddenly from 30 k's away come in the 155 shells, and the tanks aren't very happy with them.
The old Russian notion of deep battle has definitely had a revival through this, in that the Azeris in particular are interdicting resupply a long way back from the Armenian front lines.
And it's not only just interdicting, it's targeted interdiction rather than hitting the soft targets that are highly valuable, rather than trying to hit once they've actually gotten, they're not bothering to shoot the guys on the ground because and the tanks on the ground, because they're hard to hit, they're dug in, whereas your soft skin stuff, you deprive your frontline troops of food, water, ammo and fuel, and they're going to stop working pretty quick.
Yeah. Anyway, so it's hard to find good sources on this, particularly good sources that are in English. Some of the military think tanks around the world are producing open source information on it if you want to follow it. So definitely worth having a look into. Now let's get back to, we are talking today about the best tank in the world,
the Type 95 Ha-Go.
So the iconic Japanese tank.
Correct. So built from 1936. 2,300 of them were made.
To 1943, I love as an interesting stat, because at that point the Japanese were like, not building any more tanks.
No, they did build plenty more tanks after that point, but they didn't deploy them outside of the Japanese islands. So they built some very good tanks in limited numbers.
More prototypes almost, really.
No, they had runs of about 200 for a number of tanks from 43 onwards that were very good tanks, but they're only deployed on the Japanese home islands in order to stop to fight against any invasion force from the Americans.
Yeah. So Type 95 entered service in 1936. In some ways, look, I have, to my great shame and embarrassment, literally been showing visitors around probably I think it was the Australian War Memorial, and said, "Oh my, look, that's a Japanese tank over there," and it turned out it was a Renault FT. They do look quite similar.
They did, and the Japanese after World War One
did buy a lot of Renault FTs
and said this is a model for what they want to go with. I liked when they bought the British machine gun carrier tanks after
Cardin carriers
in the late 20s. One of them, and they were using that as their testing and learning prototypes, and one of them caught on fire because of the petrol fuel they were using.
And it was horrible.
They were so horrible, they said, yeah, we're not doing that again. So that's why they developed a decent diesel engine.
And also clad the interior of the tanks with asbestos, which is causing trouble to museums to this day.
Yep. The asbestos was also to reduce the heat for fighting in tropical and subtropical environments, unlike Northern Europe or Eastern Europe or anywhere.
But we do often think of the Empire of Japan as being pretty cavalier with the lives of its soldiers and citizens. And in this case, they looked at one tank cooking up and said, no, we don't want any of that. So someone very important must have been close enough to hear the screaming is my takeaway from that. But
So about the Hargo itself, it has 3 crew. It's 7.5 tonnes, so it's a very light tank.
Tankette, some would say.
Yeah, it's not quite a tank yet, but it's a light tank. 37mm gun, and it started off with 2 6.5mm machine guns, one mounted at the 5 o'clock position so it could shoot behind it.
No, but it was better than that. It was like one of those early He-Mans that flip around. Because, you think you're dealing with with an artillery piece, and then the turret flips around, and you're dealing with a machine gun. It's,
2 machine guns. And
the machine gun's in the bow.
Yep.
One in the bow and one in the back of the turret.
So they could, and the the commander was also the gunner, so he would be
and
firing.
And also the loader.
No, they had a loader.
No, there was the crew with the driver and the bow machine gunner.
Oh, okay.
And so it was a one-man turret.
Yep.
And
just the commander in there.
Just the commander. Utterly overworked. Terrible for tank combat.
So you could either have 2 machine guns forward or a machine gun and the 37mm cannon.
Yeah.
Firing forwards, or so they could turn. And if the commander wanted, he could shoot any infantry behind him with his own with the other machine gun.
Yeah. Now it's also worth noting. I mean, it's a very cramped turret. Obviously, I haven't been in one. No, there's only a handful of people alive who've been inside at the time.
But built for Japanese dimensions, so small.
Built for Japanese dimensions, that helps, I guess. But the point I'm really trying to make is that the commander trying to shoot the main gun and also decide if he wants to flip the turret around to shoot the machine gun, that I can only imagine the firing mechanism is jabbing into his back most of the time.
So they started off with these 6.5mm machine guns, and they upgunned theirs to the 7.7mm machine guns later on. Very effective in China. So they deployed them throughout China while they were overrunning the various warlords there.
Now, again, we spoke off mic. I have struggled to ever find any source in English that talks about how they use these tanks in river and other open water crossings, because they definitely did. They attacked Singapore using this. If someone knows how they actually did it and what sort of craft, we think it must have been some sort of barges. Were they motorised barges? The fact it was such a light tank at just over 7 tonnes definitely helped them. They didn't need enormous amounts of barge.
And that was one of the aspects of the lack of infrastructure, whether it's rail, road, or big bridges in China at that point in time, meant that
lots of rivers in China. Lots of rivers.
You couldn't have your 60-ton tanks trying to drive over one of those bridges because it would just collapse. And they had narrow gauge railways, so again, you couldn't have a wide tank sitting on your railway. So what infrastructure there was there, you had to have a small tank for it. It was not compatible with having bigger tanks.
Now, I know everyone loves talking about tank suspension. Certainly everyone who listens to this podcast. Now, the Hargo used a thing called bell crank suspension, which is kind of cute, and it's a really clever solution to a really particular problem.
And developed by the Japanese themselves.
Yep. But the point is that it puts all the machinery of the suspension on the outside of the tank, which, if you're saying, oh my God, heavy tanks, it's like, oh, this is terrible. You're exposing a vital part to enemy fire. The point is, these suspension parts were actually heavier gauge than the armour of the tank. So, in terms of taking damage, it works out just fine. It's tougher than the hull of the tank, so it's fine. If you were trying to put it on a 1944 vintage heavy tank, terrible idea. But it did save internal space, whereas things like torsion bars eat up a huge amount of space inside the tank, and there is not a lot of space to spare in a Hargo.
No. But it did provide a very rough ride for the crew inside. So while it could go across cross terrain quite quickly and quite well. It was not a smooth ride. It was very bumpy in there, so you're not
still
firing.
better than walking.
You're not firing on the go is the main thing.
Yeah, no one was firing on the go in World War II.
But, okay, and this brings us to another point. It was an infantry support vehicle, right?
Yeah.
The Japanese, part of their doctrine was all about we're putting together these battalions, brigades, division, tank brigades, and they're there to support the infantry. So while they did have some motorised infantry with them, and they had a number of tanks would go forward, they didn't have the large body tanks doctrine to support mass tank battles. Right. So the first big mass tank battle they got their hats handed to them by the Russians.
We'll have to talk about Nomahan, or Khalkhin-Gol, depending on how you want to talk about. Biggest battle you've never heard of in 1939 determined the future of the world in many real ways. Shall we talk about that now, or do you want to keep talking on the specs of the tank for a bit?
Let's keep going on the specs of the tank. Mm-hmm. So, look, one of the things that, while people think about Japan and they say, they didn't have any tanks, at the beginning of the war in 1939, the European war, because they'd obviously been at war for the last 8 years by that point.
In China.
Yep, in China. By 1939, they actually had the fifth largest tank army in the world after the Germans, Brits, Russians, French, and Americans.
I don't think the Americans had
no,
that big
they
army.
didn't. So they had. Yeah, so basically it was only the Europeans who had more than they did. So again, they had a lot of tanks. It's just, yes, they were smaller, but they were built for the environment and the infrastructure they were trying to deal with.
And also note, it was a Mitsubishi power plant, which means they could build it totally indigenously, and that was a capability a lot of countries that thought of themselves as being quite serious didn't have at that point.
Yeah,
so.
Again, one of the things with Japan and going through their militaristic phase was they'd seen a lot of the other tanks being built around the world by the Brits and the French and even some of the German ones, and they said, right, we're going to build these things ourselves. We're not going to buy other people's tanks. And the Japanese attitude has always been, okay, take what other people do who do it best, and we'll improve it. So just like their beer, whiskey, fried chicken, all right, curry, take what the rest of the world do it slightly better.
Look, I don't think Japanese curry is
katsu curry
that
is
good.
Katsu curry is brilliant.
I think the Indians are still the kings on that myself.
I know.
But I will say, certainly the Japanese can make
fried chicken.
Very good. Anything they set their minds to, they can make very well. And many things that only Japanese care about that no one else pays attention to.
So I'm not going to stop about this one because I'm just going to say Japanese fried chicken, best in the world.
Koreans would beg to differ, but and obviously the folks of Kentucky. But let's move on from the fried chicken wars. I think at this point, let's talk about the Battle of Nomahan, which was crucial both to Japanese doctrine and to Japanese strategy, and the experience of the Hago was crucial too. So we'll get into the battles of the T-95, which are huge. I mean, the thing was in action for 15 years just about. 10 years.
10 years.
Yeah. And so Nomahan was fought up in northern Manchuria on basically the Russian, what now we now view as the Russian-Chinese border area. At the time, the Japanese had been in northern China for a very long time and felt it was part of their empire. There was a huge...
Just remember, the Russians and the Germans still had a treaty at this stage. This is between May and August 1939, so the Russians and the Germans were not at war.
Yeah, but also remember, a little bit before this, all the German tank corps was actually based in Russia because the Germans weren't allowed to have tanks. And it's only been in relatively recent years that that's become better known because it was so secret at the time. Anyway, the Russians and the Japanese had a battle. At the time, there's a big internal fight in Japan as to whether they should go north, attack into Russia, seize Siberia. Lots of natural resources, not too many people. A lot to be said for a country like Japan, or go south, which means tangling with the European powers, the British, the Dutch, the Americans.
And one's land-based, the other one's naval-based.
Yeah, so fights between the Navy and the Army as to which way would be better. They got in a big fight in the Soviets in 1939 at the Battle of Khalkhin-Gol, also known as the Battle of Nomahan, sometimes called the Battle of the Five Winds.
Khalkhin-Gol was the area. Nomahan was the actual. I mean, there was a number of activities over that 3-month period.
Yeah, it was a big
but
battle.
it was the Nomahan was the actual decisive day, decisive battle.
Big point is that the Japanese had a very, very, very miserable time trying to deal with Russian armour with esprit de corps and strong language.
There was also 550 Russian BT tanks versus 73 Japanese tanks.
Now, the Japanese were trying to do things like use air power and artillery to suppress the Russian tanks, which many a good army has tried to do. Often it's better to just have your own tanks. It was fighting on pretty open ground, and the BTs had a 400-metre gun gap on the Japanese Hargos for effective fire, which is, again, if you've got to close 400 metres while being shot at before you can shoot, that's not pleasant.
No, and the Hargo does not have a lot of armour, so like 60 mil in the front, and they're not that quick. They do 45 k's on the road and have a 200 kilometre range.
45k was pretty good for the 1930s.
It is, but it's still...
When you're closing 400 metres, you feel every kilometre you don't have,
So they went in with their 73 tanks, and they had some good initial wins, but essentially because they didn't have a strong tank doctrine, they went in piecemeal, and so while they would have some individual platoon and company wins, then the Russians would then let them. Once they would get in, they wouldn't be able to go any further, and the Russians would just surround and destroy them. So they lost 42 tanks overall, and didn't have the idea of a doctrine for mass tank battles, and that was one of the turning points of saying, well, they didn't know how to use tanks that way. They were always a infantry support vehicle because they were very good at using infantry.
Yeah. Anyway, from a narrative point of view, the Japanese lost and said, stuff fighting the Soviets. They're a lot harder than we thought. The corrupt and decadent European empires of Southeast Asia are where we want to take easy pickings, which, with the benefit of hindsight, to an extent, was a good judgment, but they didn't really figure out their end game.
No.
Certainly, they enjoyed many early successes. We can agree on.
But one of the big things was that is they chose to focus upon their naval forces and their army and navy air forces, so planes and ships rather than tanks, and building infrastructure within in China. So they said, "Yep, we're going to hold the land in China that we've got, and then focus on building more planes and ships in order to expand into Southeast Asia and the Pacific."
Yeah.
And with limited resources in steel, fuel, what else? Oil, essentially.
Look, they ended up coming to the same conclusion that everyone else did, that you'd rather have a plane than a tank. So we're back with the beer review.
Beer review today, because we're pairing our Japanese tank with a Japanese beer. What a surprise! So
It's the best beer in the world.
Sapporo Premium Beer, the 650ml can, silver bullet.
So, for those who haven't had the pleasure, the Sapporo Premium, it's like a $12 can, isn't it?
Oh, $9.50, yes. Like
you got a discount.
Yes.
Nice. And the can is shaped like a beer glass and is just dressed in beautiful aluminium with some printing on it. And I like it when a can lets the can material talk, because the aluminium is an attractive metal, you know.
Good shiny metal.
And Japanese have mastered lager, and the best thing about Japanese lager is you tend not to wake up with hangovers.
No.
Well, mind you, can't afford to drink so many, but...
well, not outside of Japan. In Japan, they have them in nice vending machines at the bottom of your hostel, and for about $4.50, and anybody...
Now, back in the good old days, they had the beer vending machines out on the street, but they did realise that the children of Japan, good children though they were availing themselves of them. So now you have to be inside some sort of facility where there's some sort of monitoring before you see a beer vending machine. But I remember the happy days of just doing a bar crawl, just walking down the street with my brother. Oh, time for another beer. Yep. Click.
Yeah. But as I was saying before, the Japanese took beers from other places and said, how can we make this better? And they've done a damn good job.
Australian barley, mind you.
There you go.
That is an absolute key. I was at a brewers conference a couple of years ago, and an American expert was sort of scratching his head in wonder, saying, "Wow, Australian barley is just a perfect beer making profile. You guys are really lucky." And I had to put my hand up and say, "I think you'll find the Japanese have been directing Australian barley genetics for 50 years." He's like, "Oh."
Maybe that's why China doesn't want to buy our barley anymore, because they found out it was directed by the Japanese.
That could be it. I'm sure it's still very good barley for making beer. Someone will buy it. Just turn the ship around. Anywho, Japanese Sapporo Premium. If you want, lager is a very complicated beer to make, but quite a simple beer to drink, which is why it's so popular.
Mm-hmm.
And this is kind of like the ultimate endpoint of lager make. I just can't imagine anyone making a better lager and it still tasting like a lager or being a lager.
It's a beautiful colour.
A little on the pale side, maybe, but it's fine. It's good. And anything you ever thought you liked in, beer before you got into all the craft beers and the hops and stuff. Simple, easy drinking. Quite expensive, but hey, treat yourself every now and then.
Damn straight. So we are.
Oh man,
Sapporo Premium Beer, good beer.
And I'm drinking it straight out of the can. Rob's poured it into a glass.
Didn't pour as well, because obviously it's not designed to be poured; it's designed to be drunk straight out of the can.
I mean, it's quite a slurpy noise. Let's see if we can capture that on mic. Aren't you lucky? Okay, let's get back to tanks, shall we?
Yes.
Now we get to talk about the fall of Singapore, which is it's a really funny thing, because Australians have lots of opinions about the fall of Singapore, and quite a lack of knowledge about it.
Well, we've just been reading the various Daily Telegraph version of it, essentially.
Yeah,
what we know is our cultural history, rather than actually bothering to go to the library and actually read something by somebody who actually knew something.
Yeah, and it wasn't helped that there were so many lies told about it during the war years by various people trying to defend their reputations. Now, this also heavily involved the Australian 8th Division, which is the... it's a funny one, because, in parts, the 8th Division fought extremely hard. We're going to talk about the Battle of Muar, where the Australian 8th Division destroyed a very large number of Hargo tanks. But also by the, I think March 1942, the 8th Division had ceased to exist after a series of defeats, and most of its men spent out the war and dying in prisoner of war camps. There was also many infamous island defences where the 8th Division officers gave orders like every man for himself while they got on a boat. So it was mixed, and I do not want to detract from the very many brave men who fought extremely well in the 8th Division, but it was a cursed command. I think the men who fought in it would agree it was an unlucky command. And also, to some extent, it was raised late. The 6th Division and the 9th Division are the famous Australian divisions of World War II that did extremely well. And the 8th had the misfortune to cop the Japanese on the rise and have to give a sort of a scattered resistance to them across the South Pacific. So, Japanese invaded from Thailand. No one ever talks about why
Malaysia.
the Thais... They're from Thailand, though.
Oh, okay.
Into Malaysia.
Yep.
The Thais have kept very quiet in the interwar years about why they allowed an enormous Japanese army to assemble on the Malayan border. And Malaysia,
probably because they had lots of tanks.
I think they were kind of hoping that the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere was, something a lot of Asians thought would be a good idea. And frankly, given the horrors of Western colonialism in Asia, I do not blame them for thinking that
Thailand being one of the few kingdoms actually
wasn't colonised. Well, directly colonised. It still had a lot of cashed up people doing horrible things to their children.
That wasn't until Vietnam. When the Americans got there.
Cashed up people doing horrible things to people's children is kind of part of the whole colonial project, unfortunately. It's the bit we don't talk about so much. Anyway, Japanese invade over the Thai border. And, we think of Malaysia as a bit of a backwater country these days. But at the time, 90% of the world's rubber was being made in, at the time, Malaya, what we now call Malaysia. And this was before you had silicon rubber. This was before you had synthetic rubber.
When rubber was a vital war resource.
Absolutely vital to any sort of modern industrial undertaking. Now, within months of the Japanese invasion of Malaya,
the world had to develop synthetic rubber.
particularly in America, they developed a synthetic rubber industry. Sorry, I'm just going to let this dog into this room.
Apologies for the dog interruption, but those things happen in a house full.
That's right. Now, so the point is, and this is about tanks, trust me. If nothing, because final drive seals... no. Final drive seals are, made out of rubber. So many things in a tank are made out of rubber. Japanese T-95s were a major part of the invasion. There's often talk about all the bicycles. The Japanese troops on bicycles definitely happened. Interesting thing was, Japanese did not take the bicycles with them.
So where did they come from?
They stole them.
There you go.
They had scouted Malaya much better than the British had realised, and had realised that every village, farm, everyone was just getting around on bicycles, partly because they had all the rubber in the world, so they were making lots of tyres. And the country was full of bicycles, so the Japanese, as they invaded, grabbed bicycles and started moving around on them. Also, they had some very... advanced at the time ideas about not securing their own flanks, and that enabled them to attack around the flanks of the British
essentially
forces.
it's a bicycle blitzkrieg, because if you can spearhead through the enemy front line and get in behind and take out whatever they're doing, and you're self-sufficient enough to be able to do it, then as long as they're crumbling before you do, you win.
Very much so. I mean, Slim, who was, he lived here in Canberra for many years as Governor General, but was definitely the best British general in the East, and some would argue the best British general of World War II, made the point that if the Japanese are attacking you in the flank, it means he's left his rear open to you. And you, instead of panicking that, oh my God, they're on the flank, what you need to be doing is organising a proper counter-attack to where they've left themselves vulnerable. But at the time, the commanders on the ground just felt they were being attacked in the flank and didn't know why, and hadn't thought the whole thing through. There was a lot of panic, and the effect of panic in World War II is one of those interesting things that happens over and over again, where it's contagious and it sets in. And this is where psychological warfare comes from. If you can get it into people's heads that they are losing and they need to run away.
Just remember, you're also looking from a white man's perspective of... They all thought that these Japanese don't know how to fight, and had been ignoring the fact that their military had been gaining a whole lot of experience in China for the last 10 years, and then suddenly to say, oh, we'll be able to see them off.
It's an interesting case of...
But strangely enough, raw recruits don't do so well against battle-hardened troops.
Yeah, but it's an interesting case of believing your own propaganda. I mean, the evidence was there to anyone who was looking at the evidence that the Japanese knew what they were doing on a number of fronts.
Had been doing it for a while and knew how to do it.
Japanese humiliated the Russians at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905. Japanese humiliated German regular troops in World War I in China. The Japanese obviously knew what they were doing and weren't all people with bottle-thick glasses who spoke funny.
Yeah, and couldn't fly planes.
Yeah, anyone who was paying attention knew that, but there was this propaganda line told to the domestic audience, which had then filtered back into the military planning.
At that stage, you had the colonies were still white man's justice and rule, and anybody else was looked down upon.
Yeah. So the Hagos came south, and probably the Battle of Muar. There was also Jena was another battle. There were a few battles where Australians actually managed to put up a decent resistance. I wouldn't say Australians were the only ones who put up a decent resistance, but they, as is often the way, the British used the Australians as shock troops, and 2-pounder guns were just fine for punching through Japanese tanks, and the Japanese were advancing so fast you could get them into ambushes. It did happen, and it worked.
But unfortunately, they didn't have their own armour to be able to stop their advance.
Oh yeah, and the idea of counterattacking was utterly beyond them. And as long as the Japanese kept flooding past and getting into the flanks, there was sorry, I think Taylor was his name. I wish I could remember it. There was a classic case of an Australian colonel, I think, who ended up in charge of a whole brigade and managed to extract them and get them back to Singapore, where they then all had to surrender, of course. He won the Victoria Cross for his leadership over 3 days of, and this is a bespectacled, very ordinary looking guy who'd was a bank clerk before he ended up in the army, but just actually took some responsibility for things and kept busting through Japanese lines as they.
He probably knew how to handle spreadsheets, is what it was.
I think he just took what he was doing seriously, which always helps.
Now back to the Type 95. They did have a number of firsts, this tank. So,
okay. You're going to go to the Americans?
We're going to go to the Americans.
Can we quickly finish the assault on the causeway?
Yes.
Okay, so the Australian 22nd Brigade was assigned to guard the causeway, which links Singapore to Malaya. Now, exactly what happened is the subject of considerable dispute, but fundamentally they decided to withdraw and didn't communicate particularly well that they were withdrawing, and the Japanese were thus able to cross the causeway with their Hargo tanks on some sort of pontoon. Now, there was an amphibious version of the Hargo that had little attachable pontoons, but
they had a number of amphibious tanks that came later on in the war.
Yes, for 1942 Guadalcanal. So that it wasn't there at Singapore. So it was something else, again unspecified. But so the Hargo was at the absolute tip of the spear as they pulverised the off-guard, panicked defenders of Singapore, including the Australian 8th Division. And in that sense, the lightness of it and the fact that they could get it across a pretty large stretch of water between Singapore and
Malaya.
Now, there is the issue that the causeway had been demolished, but the demolition job had only made it at low tide about waist deep. But that still meant you had to advance up the causeway and then wade through water and keep advancing along the causeway to attack along it. And it's quite easy to defend along a single open line. That's not a great way to go.
No, if the defenders know what they're doing.
Yeah. And haven't run away. Yeah. Okay, let's talk about the Americans now.
No, the firsts. The Hargo was the first tank the Americans ever faced in the war when they landed in the Philippines and took on some Stuarts and other American light tanks. They didn't do very well against those, but they still took the Philippines, mainly because of numbers and better infantry and naval support. So that was the first of facing off the American. The first time American tanks had faced other tanks in battle.
Should we mention the Japanese knee mortars at this point?
I can't remember the knee port.
Basically, the Japanese had a very early version of a squad heavy weapon. It was called a knee mortar because there was this idea in the West that they fired these mortars from their knees. It turned out that wasn't what they did. They put them on the ground.
I was about to say, you would just break your knees if you were doing
exactly.
that. Exactly. But what you're saying is like a smaller version of a 60mm company mortar.
Yeah, that sort of thing. Yeah. And they had them down at platoon level, which was a significant part of the Japanese success was having reasonably heavy weapons down at very low levels. But what they didn't do was keep developing it through the war. So things like the Piat and the bazooka became much better versions of that later in the war. But early on, no one had that kind of heavy weaponry down at platoon level the way the Japanese did. Which also helped for fighting thin-skinned vehicles like Stuarts.
Anything you can just lob over the top of whatever intervening terrain or...
I think they could hold them against trees and fire them directly as well.
Okay.
But definitely not on their knees, even though we call them knee mortars.
No.
Yes.
They were just probably kneeling around them as they fired them off.
Yes. Now, moving through the Hargo's fights, when the Japanese landed at Milne Bay in what's now Papua New Guinea, the Australian tried to engage them with sticky bombs.
But it was too humid.
Yes,
so
and it's always
tanks were sweating, and the sticky bombs would not stick.
Yes.
So whether or not that was a first, I'm not sure, but the other first.
But the tanks ended up just getting bogged down in the mud around Milne Bay,
Yep.
so they had to be abandoned.
Yep. The other, there's only two of them. The other first that they are the only tank to have fought on North American soil. So
Have the Mexicans never had any tanks fight each other?
No. Fighting each other?
Yeah, well, Mexicans fight each other reasonably often.
Yeah, that's more revolutionary. People's revolution type stuff.
I'm just surprised. I mean, definitely in US soil, definitely.
There's plenty of tanks been fighting in South America.
Yes,
we're talking North America.
It surprised me. Panama. There's a few bits of technical North America.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah,
I think when we talk North America, those are Central America. When we're talking North America, it's Mexico, US, and Canada. That's your three.
All right. Okay. We're having to move the goalposts here. But sure.
We are. But anyway, so in June 42, the Japanese invaded the island of Attu, which is part of the Aleutian chain of islands, and they took the 150 people from the island and sent them back to Japan. But they had taken the island and they were saying, right, this is now Japanese. But in May 43, the US troops landed, and there was actually a battle between US tanks and the Hago was on the island as well. And basically it was a bit of a massacre all around. It was cold, wet, miserable, no support, no planes could get in because it was all foggy and it was too windy, and it was not a fun time for anybody, but eventually the Americans won. But it was again a first of a enemy tank fighting on North American soil. So there you go.
Now, in this podcast, obviously before you joined us, Rob, has talked about the Matilda and the Matilda's deployment in the Pacific. In many ways, the Matilda is your perfect Hago killer, isn't it?
It was. It had the armour that the Hago could not get through. It had manoeuvrability. Even though it was slow, it had the manoeuvrability. And it had a decent, accurate gun that
goes straight through the side,
straight through the front. Yeah, straight through the front of the Hago. It was not.
There is no angle you can shoot a Matilda's 40mm cannon at a Hago that will not wreck it.
No. And with while the Matildas are slow, they are heavily armoured and just would bounce the Hago 37mm rounds every day of the week.
Conversely, though, the Hago did have a very effective high explosive round for a 37mm cannon, which for supporting infantry is much more useful than an armour-piercing round. And also,
exactly. And that's what it was designed for, that's what it was deployed as, and that's what the doctrine said. You move forward with the infantry and do that. There was a couple of times where the Hago did have to take on the Shermans, and they did not. That was never a good battle for the Hago, because the Shermans had their frontal and turret armour was far too thick for it. The only way you could do any sort of damage is to get onto the size of them. And if the American tank commanders knew what they were doing, that they would not let that happen.
But you get back to the weight and logistics arguments, and the same thing that made the Sherman a great tank
in Europe.
In Europe was that they could have more of them, so they could mob any of the rare big cats they came across, and similarly a 7-ton Hago for the same given logistics capability, you can get 4 or 5 of them onto the island compared to a Sherman. Now, the Americans had so much more logistics than the Japanese that they could also have more Shermans than Hagos, and at that point the Hago's in trouble. But this comes down to the whole point that the city of Pittsburgh produced more steel than the entire Empire of Japan.
Yeah, I mean, the Japanese were in their highest point of the war, were producing like 38 tanks a month, whereas the US probably producing 1,000 or more. Yeah,
and this just comes down to why, even though the initial the Japanese were right in their assessment that the European empires in the Western Pacific were rotten and corrupt and could be kicked down. They were absolutely correct in that assessment, and they proved themselves correct. What they couldn't deal with was the counterattack that they unleashed upon themselves by doing it,
or by engaging the US and the US industrial depth that could be turned towards them.
Yeah, but I mean, the Japanese only saw well, obviously not all the Japanese. Many Japanese spent a lot of time in the US. They knew exactly what they were dealing with. Japanese leadership saw what it wanted to see, and it saw the corrupt, quite hated government of the Philippines, and said, we can take that out. And they were right. What they couldn't deal with was the retaliation.
If the Americans hadn't been in the Philippines, it would have been very easy for the Japanese to ignore America altogether and to say, "Yep, we've just taken all of this, and it's none of your business."
Yeah, I mean, it's a great counterfactual what if, isn't it? What if the Japanese had just ignored the Philippines? If they hadn't attacked Pearl Harbor?
Well, if they hadn't attacked Pearl Harbor and the Americans hadn't have been in the Philippines because they'd been had taken those in the Spanish-American War in 40 years earlier.
Yeah.
So if they hadn't have done that, then if the Americans weren't involved in that area of the world, who knows what could have happened in that point?
Yeah, I mean, just imagine if Americans hadn't gone into Cuba, their politics would be a lot saner today. But anywho, getting back to the Hargo, I think the likeness of it for the effects it delivered make it, if not the best tank in the world, which I will concede it probably was not, a really good tank, because it keeps getting compared with tanks that weigh 4 times as much.
And had been developed long after it was. So basically, one of the aspects I did read up about was along with the formation doctrines, the actual doctrines of how the tanks were maintained and what you could do to them. They were so rigid, you weren't allowed to do any sort of modifications to the tank. So there were no external bins. There were no ability to carry troops with you, or if they want to sit on the back of the tank. It was.
I have seen video of Japanese Hargos carrying squads across Manchuria.
Yeah, but
it definitely happened.
I'm sure it probably definitely happened, but it was all. It was all pushed that they were standardised, and they were not. You didn't put any extra ammo bins on the outside. You didn't do this and that and everything else. And you say to yourself, a lot of other countries would say, "Okay, somebody's in their ivory tower and their nice offices designed and built this thing, but me as the squatty on the ground who I want to be able to have some ammo on the outside, or have basically be able to store an extra blanket or something on the outside that doesn't fit on the inside."
This is a tough issue.
I know.
Because, and Patton absolutely hated field modifications because, in his view, by the time the troops left to their own devices, had covered the outside of the tank in sandbags and sleepers and railroad ties, the tank couldn't go anywhere. And, again, he wanted the Shermans as light as they could be to actually go places and do things, whereas...
And when they got there, they realised, if only we had some railway ties and sleepers, we could go even further.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough one, though, because, I mean, troops don't want to die, and that's a fundamental part of human nature.
So with the Type 95, they actually did have a number of quirks and innovations on the tank itself. They had a little speaking button, because it was infantry support. They had a little button. You could, as an infantry person...
It was a ring button, though. It wasn't a support button, but it was hidden as a bolt, wasn't it?
It was hidden as a bolt. You could walk up, press this, and then speak into a tube to be able to talk to the commander.
Speaking tube as well, okay.
Yep. So you can say, "Yep, I want to talk to the commander, and I need you to lay in some HE over in this direction, or don't run...
Or don't back up because there's people behind you.
Yeah, that sort of thing. It also had one of the first ones they captured in Burma was taken back to India, and they studied it and everything, and they had the Allies produce a wonderful little video on how to take it out and what to do with it, whether it's jamming a metal canteen up underneath the turret.
Didn't they say you should put a bayonet in the turret ring? Yeah,
you can do, but there was also a point where the turret turns. There will be a gap under the turret, between the turret and the hull, that you could actually jam a metal canteen into, and it'll jam the turret there. Or, as you say, the actual turret ring, you can actually run up and jam your bayonet into that, and that'll prevent turning of the turret as well.
I have to say, if I'm a soldier fighting in a
Jungle
war,
warfare, you can get
and
quite close.
I've not been given a better weapon for dealing with a tank.
Well, the sticky bombs don't stick.
I would kind of be of the view that the folks who sent me there, it's on them, you know?
They did also point out the blind spots on the tank to be able to say, okay, if you're going to come at this thing, you come at it from this side because there is a big blind spot where there is no pistol vision, pistol hole or vision slit on this area. Mm-hmm. Or if you want to drop a Molotov cocktail, you do it into this vent on the back of the tank.
Oh, come on. If you're throwing Molotov cocktails, the whole back deck of any tank is where you want to put them.
Yeah. But I was saying,
the engine will be there. It will have breathing ports. Even if all you do is put smoke in the breathing ports, you can still put the engine out.
Yeah. So, I mean, it was a good little video of watching how to... and built and done in 1942, or 43, sorry, of how to disable the tank, and saying, okay, if you're a rifleman, there is these bogies on the back that if you shoot this one, it's the rear bogey of... there was two bogies on the back. If you shoot this one on the inside of the track, it'll disable the track and so forth. So it was an interesting little watch, I got to say, from the time, and saying, yep, do this, do that. Here's how you take it out from an ally's point of view. So it did have its quirks, and but yeah,
I would still. I'd need some additional motivation to assault a tank with a water bottle or a knife. It's particularly a tank with two 7.7mm machine guns.
Yes.
One of them in a turret.
Yes.
You know,
it was a manual.
If my wife and family were,
it was a manual turret, so there was no. So they had to.
That's why you could jam it with weird things.
Because they had to. The thing is, the commander in there had to turn it manually, mechanically. So there was no electronics or
no power assist. Yeah.
No power assist. So it's not like he was turning quick. So
I mean, a lot of tanks of that era, the commander literally put his shoulders into little indents and turned the shoulders to move the turret.
If you've got good ball bearings and
a balanced turret, it's not that hard.
Yeah.
At the same time, this is a failure of this tank. Is the workload on the commander was insanely intense. I mean, you got a driver and a bow gunner just sitting there doing nothing. Meanwhile, you're loading the gun and looking for the enemy, and shouting out, "Go over there, go over there,"
and listening to the infantry saying, "Don't back up."
Through a speaking tube, yeah. It's interesting because as you know, when we talked about Matilda, Matilda also had a doorbell, which, because it was an electrical conduit, was replaced later in the war. They just wired telephone handsets into the doorbell conduit, and to this day, I think the latest upgrade to the M1, they put the telephone back on.
We were speculating that a couple of months ago. We didn't know whether or not they had.
I think I read something somewhere that they were actually going to do that, because fundamentally you've got your battle networks and what have you, but there just comes a time when being able to pick up a device and talk to the person inside is
when you don't want to have to go through 3 layers of communication because
intelligence,
because they are on different
networks.
Yeah.
But also just, you broadcast on your radio, and to all the, electronic warfare packages on your battlefield, you're broadcasting "Hello, I am here," and then the tank is broadcasting "Hello, I am here" when it responds to you, and you just said, "We are both here, right next to each other." That's not good.
where you can just take a wrench, walk up the side of it, and go shaving a haircut, bang bang, and say, "Can you talk to me, please?"
Yeah.
But now, having spoken about the Hargo, I want to introduce the idea of the OI. I want to give them a special mention. It was only produced in blueprints, but the OI was the super heavy project of the Japanese tank forces. 120 tons, 3 turrets, and 11 crew.
Yeah, things have gone wrong when you want more than 1 turret on a tank. But
yes, it had a 105, a 47, and a 37 in each.
Now, this is always why tank designs devolve back to one turret, one gun. It's like, what are you going to do with your 37 that the 105 couldn't do better?
Well, they were developing this for the defense of Japan against an expected invasion. So they had grand ideas of
Well, I get the design bureau needs to be kept in work because, at some point you want them to design something useful, and in the meantime they can do pie-in-the-sky stuff and see what they come back with.
They came out with 2 prototypes of I think it was the Type 597 or something like that. That at the end of the war they said, well, we don't want these falling into Allied hands, so they drove them into a lake. And so these 2 prototypes got driven into a lake, and only one of them's ever been found. So,
gosh, there's a collectible for you.
Go now and find that one. Oh, speaking of Attu, so once the island was taken back by the U.S. forces, and after the war it was no longer manned. A lot of that stuff was just left there. Because the people who'd been taken off by the Japanese did not go back, weren't allowed to go back to that island. They had to go back to another Aleutian island, and so the detritus of the Battle of Masca Bay is all still pretty much sitting there.
Okay, look, we're closing in on an hour, but I just wanted to quickly run through the variants of the Hargo to get back to the core of the tank, because there were a lot and there's some interesting ones. So we had there were 3 main production runs, and it's worth noting as well, this was not produced just by one company. Like every Japanese heavy industrial company produced a version of the Hargo. Mitsubishi made all the diesel engines, but the tanks were churned out all over the place. There was a crane vehicle with a 3-ton crane, which I can see how it's useful, but if you can't lift another tank, is it really? What I really like is...
What's the engines, power pack and so
forth. I guess, you can build a field workshop around it, but you just need a better workshop, don't you? There was an armoured railroad car, which I love the idea of Hargos zipping down the Chinese rail lines under their own power. In a past part of my life, I did some railway maintenance for a historical society, and we had these little things powered by Volkswagen engines that we could zip up and down the rail lines on. And I'd love if anyone could ever find one of those railroad cars, you could make a great documentary about a journey.
Well, considering the GAN railway channel, it was just 3 hours of staring, or 24 hours of staring at the rail line.
I think
and the passing terrain.
I think it would be an exciting adventure to take the Type 95 Soki armoured railroad car on across the Trans-Siberian or something like that.
So damn those checkpoints.
Well, I know enough about railways. You need to contact your local railway access body and say, I'm going to be occupying this bit of track for the next 20 minutes. But there's little phones all along the railway lines where you negotiate those things. Anywho, that sounds cool. The amphibious tank only came in 1942, but obviously they had some solution they were using, which I'm still looking for how they were crossing rivers in China and how they got across the straits into Singapore. Johor Bahru, I think it's called. What else have we got? There was a version with a 57mm gun, the Kenu. Mm-hmm. A self-propelled gun, the Hoto, which had a 120mm howitzer in an open casemate. That sounds very exciting. And then there was a tank destroyer version similar to the Hetzer, but armed with a 47mm main gun, which seems kind of pointless.
Well, it was high velocity though, so it was. Okay. But again, not built in enough numbers and not deployed in such a way as to be able to threaten the Shermans that they should have been used against. The later upgun versions with the 57mm and 75mm guns were all kept within Japan themselves. So the home islands.
It's too small a tank for a really big piece of artillery. I think what needs to be appreciated with the Hago is that it was very well designed to fit within a doctrinal requirement to serve a role.
Yes.
That was quite well thought out to a point, and when they designed the thing in, 1934, production starting in 36,
Yes.
it was an exceptionally good armoured vehicle for its time. The fact that it lingered in service to the end of World War II when so many better things were available, it shouldn't detract from it.
And logistics have changed and everything else. That,
Yeah. But it's I would call it a very successful design that served its purpose extremely well.
Oh, I agree. And you build what you need for the time that you need it in, and the environment you need it in. You don't build the best design for one environment and then deploy it in another. You build what you need for where you need it.
Yeah, but it
can't do everything with one thing.
Yeah, underrated tank, I would say. But obviously, I don't want to play it in World of Tanks. You can get your ass kicked. Because World of Tanks and those sort of simulations or games, they're just games. Don't account for the fact that you have to figure out how much logistics you've got to get the things to the battlefield.
Get across the bridge and
yeah.
Yeah, and now get 15 tanks from one side of the country, 300 k's down the railway line to another. When you've got to go through a tunnel that's only a certain amount wide, and your tanks won't actually fit through there unless they're small.
Yeah, I mean, there was a famous case in, I think it was the 1950s, where the US Army tried to move a heavy tank force from one side of Kentucky to the other, and it took them 4 weeks to assemble the rolling stock. And I think by the time they'd started to assemble the rolling stock to the point they needed, the rolling stock started being requisitioned back by its owners. And they basically realised that they couldn't move their tanks just from one side of Kentucky to the other.
It's much like Australia when they realised that the tank training area in Puckapunyal and the tank used area in Darwin are a long way away from each other, and 30 years ago, there weren't a lot of railway.
We have built a heavy railway just pretty much to move the tanks from Puckapunyal to Darwin.
Yes.
Bridging 37 major rivers.
About 30 years ago, we didn't have it.
Yeah. All right, I think we're
pretty much done
on this podcast. Thank you so much for listening all the way through. I think we'll be back sooner than later.
And we'll give you a hint that might be in Italian.
Oh, okay. War.